Hello and welcome to our Political Fix webinar for FT subscribers on 10 years after Brexit. Can the UK deliver change? I'm Lucy Fisher, the Whitehall editor and host of our Political Fix podcast. And with me in the studio in London to discuss this are political editor George Parker, markets columnist Katie Martin, economics columnist Delphine Strauss, and political columnist Stephen Bush. Welcome to all of you. As Britain prepares to usher in its seventh Prime Minister in a decade, the so-called King of the North, Andy Burnham, we've already received more than 100 questions from you, our audience, including about what a difference a change of leader might make to the country's fortunes. 10 years on from the EU referendum, we'll also look at whether a major shift in the UK's relationship with the bloc is on the horizon. During the next hour, we'll endeavour to answer as wide a selection of questions as possible, along with any others you might add to the chat box on your screen. So let's get started. I was really heartened and interested that we got so many questions wanting to get into the weeds of Brexit. So at the top, let's go straight to a question from Jeremy Wagner, who asks, there are conflicting views about whether the UK is or will be better or worse off economically from Brexit. What is the considered view of the speakers? George, to you first.
Well, thanks, Jeremy, for inviting me to revisit my PTSD of Brexit. And I had to write the FT splash on the night of June the 23rd, 2016, and it was quite a harrowing night, I have to say. Look, I mean, as you say, the numbers are disputed, the economic numbers at least, but the Office for Budget Responsibility is stuck by its forecast that Britain has been left 4% of GDP worse off over a period than if we'd stayed as part of the European Union. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has started using other studies which are available, which suggest the damage could be 6% or 8% of GDP. To put that in context, that amounts to tax revenues of 40, 50, 60 billion pounds, which would be quite useful in the current context. I think we should provide a bit of balance to that and say that there are some areas where the British economy has probably benefited a bit from having a bit more regulatory flexibility outside of the European Union. And we had Mario Draghi's report on the competitiveness of the EU, which points out that the EU, particularly in areas like technology, has been over-regulating and stifling growth in the continent. But on balance, I think most economists would agree it's been bad for Britain.
Katie, I clocked your views on social media yesterday, where I think you said Brexit was always going to be rubbish, is rubbish, and will continue to be rubbish, although you used a stronger word than
Slightly,
rubbish that I won't repeat now. So I'll also put this question from Kevin Sylvester to you. Do you perceive that we have seen the worst of the economic considerations of leaving the EU, or is there worse or more still to come?
That's a good question. It's worth rewinding a little bit. You know, my experience of that night with the Brexit referendum was very similar to George's. You know, we're all in newsrooms, you know, scattered around and watching what was unfolding. And look, you know, that night I remember it very clearly when it looked like we were going to be staying in the EU. The pound was trading at $1.50. And it nosedived and it just kept crashing through the night, you know, down to about 120 or something as it became clear that we were going to leave. And it has never recovered. And that just tells you that the way that investors are looking at the UK now has fundamentally changed, and that it's more difficult for the UK to attract foreign capital. And also it's worth remembering that the sort of benchmark UK borrowing costs at the time of the Brexit referendum, so the 10-year gilt yield, was about 1%. It's about 4.7 now. So there was a bunch of reasons that go into that, but it's much more expensive for us to borrow as a country. It is much more difficult for us to attract foreign capital. And again, you know, looking at those growth trajectories that George was just referring to, you know, we used to be pretty much, you know, wedded to the US trajectory, and we've peeled away from that and, strangely enough, got closer to Europe since the time of that vote. Again, there's a bunch of different factors there, but so have we got past the worst? There is a school of thought that possibly we have, because some of the worst impacts were sort of front-loaded, if you like. They clumped around the time when we actually departed. But the best hope that you know, economists and investors that I speak to have that we could be past the worst is that actually we get closer to Europe over time. I don't think it will heal itself. It will be something where you know there does have to be a meaningful rapprochement with Europe to turn the tide.
Delphine, keen to hear your view. And also, Patricia Ann Cross-Meadows asks, What specifically do you look at as indicators of success or failure of Brexit? So if you could say a bit more about the metrics, I think that would be interesting.
Well, so a lot of these studies that George and Katie have been referring to sort of point you towards those metrics. So one of the ways that people try to quantify the hit from Brexit, and I don't think there are conflicting views about the direction it's gone in, is to look at how the UK has fared since 2016 relative to the trajectory of countries that looked similar to us pre-referendum. And one of the more careful studies of this type, which came out at the start of this year and looked at the UK versus more than 30 countries, came up with a hit to GDP of more like 8%, so really quite a lot higher than that official OBR estimate. They also used a different methodology, which is more at the micro level, where you look at how have firms who are more exposed to the EU fared compared with firms which are less exposed. That comes up with a slightly smaller hit, perhaps 6%, and that's in GDP per capita. Whichever method you use, you see a very distinct impact on GDP per capita, a much sharper one on business investment, which shows perhaps just how much management time and energy was sucked up sort of dealing with Brexit itself rather than planning other, nice projects that might have happened in the counterfactual. And you can also see a smaller but sort of highly damaging impact on productivity, some hit on employment. And if you look at the UK's share of goods exports, that also has a very sharp fall. Not so bad for services, but...
There we go. Stephen, John Peet, the Associate Editor of The Economist, has asked, what do the speakers think about economists who claim that the UK has suffered no economic damage from Brexit? They often say Germany's slower growth than Britain proves they are right.
Well, I think that, to be honest, just defies plausibility, right? If one talks to anyone who runs a business, or indeed if you interact with the economy yourself, right? I think almost anyone who buys or sells goods, right, has experienced the transaction that doesn't happen because it is now a pain in the neck either to transmit goods to the EU from the UK, or a variety of small businesses which have gone like, actually it's not worth the candle to transmit in the other direction. But also, crucially, I think Germany's underperformance is not the same as an argument against our membership. One of the tragedies of Brexit is not just the impact on the United Kingdom, but the impact on the EU as a whole. Like, one of the ironies is since leaving, both us and the EU have become less Anglo-Saxon, right? We've become a typical European country, both in terms of our politics, which we'll get into later, but we have, it turns out in this myth, and the Brexiteers hadn't, we've become, more liberal, more free trading. We've become none of those things. We've become more protectionist. But also, the EU has changed in a way that is not to the United Kingdom's interests. But by breaking up, I think actually, to me, one of the underrated engines of British prosperity, which is the Anglo-Dutch alliance within the EU, the European Union has become much more inclined to regulate first. And although that means we can go our own way on things like AI and financial services, we would be much, much better off if we were leading on the competition agenda within the whole of the EU than being this other, also actually pretty flabby and all of the things that people rightly thought could sometimes be a problem with the European project, but in a much smaller market. So Germany's problems and the United Kingdom's problem are linked, even though we are no longer around the same table.
Let's try and be positive for a moment then, after you've all given quite definitive arguments for the negatives of Brexit. George, you also already mentioned a few regulatory freedoms. Katie, can you answer Edmund McGovern's question, what's been the greatest benefit of Brexit?
Gone for the wrong person there.
That is a really tricky one. As George says, there are some, very sort of specific areas where greater regulatory flexibility has been useful to certain companies. It's been great for companies that do the paperwork for customs. Other than that, I'm somewhat struggling. But I'd just like to pick up what Stephen was saying, actually. He makes a very good point about how the EU is a different beast without us inside it. When I go to Europe and I talk to people in European finance, they really miss us. fundamentally, like, the UK was driving the bus on European finance. It had a fantastic opportunity there to go further. Since then, the departure of the UK, I would argue, has been one of the main reasons, or certainly a large reason, why Europe has found it difficult to coalesce, difficult to strip out kind of duplication and regulation and overlapping organisations, and it could have a much more dynamic financial markets ecosystem if we were still there. So they do miss us. Trying to answer the question specifically on positives, I do find more of a stretch.
Does anyone else want to jump in with any other positives?
So I also struggle to point to big positives, but I think there will be many areas where there have been small changes or deviations from EU rules, for example, perhaps the rules for listing companies in London, where there has been a little bit more flexibility and freedom to do things as we want. I wouldn't say these transform the UK's prospects. I think they probably do mean that you're gradually creating interest groups who would perhaps object if there was a sudden rush to return to the EU.
Gene-edited crops, Lucy. There we go. There's one.
There's one. Stephen?
I think some of the Edinburgh reforms we wouldn't have been able to do within the EU, and those have been positive. I think also actually the growth shock from Brexit has at least been a helpful spur in the last few years. So under Rishi Sunak and then with the Labour government that's now on its way out, has at least slightly moved us beyond the kind of period in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis where we were declaring war on one of our areas of comparative advantage because we no longer have that luxury as a country. However, that's a pretty tiny silver lining on a pretty big cloud.
The one thing I would say is when we were writing about Brexit in the run-up to the vote, the big fear that everyone had in this building was that the City of London would be eviscerated by Brexit. True. And there were projections of huge job losses and business being transferred. I'm not saying the City of London would rather we'd stayed in that we hadn't left, but it's adapted. London has shown the British financial services industry generally has shown how adaptable it's been. And when you ask them, would you be interested in going back into the single market now? Generally, I think it's fair to say the answer is no, right?
I'm not sure the answer is no, but yeah, that's right. The city has definitely survived in much better shape than anyone predicted. And the other thing that that the levers, I guess, have got, that they can plausibly claim is, that there were all these predictions that as soon as we left the EU, there would be this kind of cliff edge recession and that there would be a very immediate short-term hit to the British economy, and that didn't materialise, and that did make it awkward for people like us, honestly, in the early stages. But the long-term forecasts for the damage to the economy, I think, are pretty incontrovertible and have been absolutely borne out. So Project Fear was Project Reality, but there was a gap in between where it wasn't clear that the damage was going to actually arrive.
Well, as well as the economic impact, it's had a huge impact on our politics in the UK. Christian Lequesne from France asks, how could we explain that we have at the same time regret, this idea of Brexit regret, and a rise of the Reform Party in the opinion polls? It seems to be contradictory. George, this is really speaking to how politics has become more polarised in the wake of the EU referendum, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Brexit referendum introduced an air of toxicity into British political discourse and debate and confrontation that I don't think I'd really experienced before. Although there was a foretaste of that a couple of years earlier with the Scottish independence referendum, which was, I covered that, and that was a really bitter campaign about identity. But both the referendums had their origins in the same idea, which was that there was there was power being exerted somewhere else, and they were to blame. In the case of the Scottish referendum, of course, it was in London. Of course, in the Brexit referendum, the people to blame were in Brussels. Now, once you take Brussels out of the equation, there's no one else to blame, basically. And I think that's to go to the question, which is a very good question. Why is it that, despite the fact that the polls suggest people regret leaving the European Union now, and the person who did more to deliver Brexit than anyone else, Nigel Farage, his party Reform UK are now leading in the opinion polls. How is that the case? Well, one thing for a start is that Nigel Farage doesn't talk about Brexit anymore, or hardly at all, because he realised nobody wants to talk about it. But the second thing is it's a politics of grievance, basically. Previously, the grievance was aimed at Brussels. Now he's basically saying, well, the political classes in Westminster didn't deliver Brexit as we'd envisaged it, and therefore in any event, it's Westminster that's the problem now. So it's now politics agreements aimed at the elite in London. So, there's always you just change the people you blame, basically, and that's what's happened, I think.
Stephen?
Well, this mystery that, he's this used car salesman where everyone hates the last vehicle he sold them, yet, according to the polls, 25% of the country is going to go, actually, we'd love to buy another car from you. But crucially, he is only getting around 25%. And I think the known unknown about Nigel Farage is, can this theoretical poll lead, which translates to local elections, but whenever there's been a parliamentary by-election and people have reached for the lever to stop him, will that still mean that he is too extreme to win an election? We see that in every poll. So Ipsos recently showing 21.5% think he'd be a great prime minister, 59% more than any other politician go, no, he'd be a bad prime minister. So those two things aren't as contradictory as they sort of initially seem. It's just that he is the candidate of the remaining group of people who are not experiencing regret.
Let's look ahead to what could happen regarding the reset between the UK and the EU. George, you've done a lot on what Starmer negotiated, but we do have a new Prime Minister coming in, very likely Andy Burnham. Gilbert Rabigui from the US asks, what would a return to the EU look like for both the UK and the EU? It's not really feasible rejoin package at the moment, is it?
Well, Gilbert, I don't know whether you want Britain to rejoin the EU, but I don't think that's a very likely scenario anytime in the near future. The opinion polls certainly suggest that there is an appetite for, well, certainly a regret about the fact that we voted to leave, but that's different to saying to people, do you actually want to take people through the different steps? Yes, in theory, they might think they would like to rejoin the European Union, but then when you ask them, would you like to use the single currency? Would you like to have big contributions to the EU budget? Would you like to have free movement of people? All those things, and then the support starts to evaporate. But more importantly, the public don't want to go back to the debates about Brexit any more than if you ask British people, they'd like to go and start talking about COVID again. It's part of the national collective psychology, which people have put in a box and don't want to go back there. So to answer the question, and it was quite interesting that Keir Starmer, when he was talking about his approach to Europe, he said incrementalism is no longer good enough. The truth is that it will be an incremental move back towards European integration. So the kind of things that were being discussed before the EU-UK summit was postponed again after Keir Starmer announced he was stepping down were things like removing trade barriers in food and drink trade, energy, having a youth mobility scheme. All these things will make a tangible difference, but they're not quite the same at all, or not the same at all, as going back into the customs union or the single market. And those things are still a long way off. And when we talk about this thing, we shouldn't, of course, forget there are two sides to this negotiation. We often talk about what we would like to do. And the moment you start talking about taking parts of the single market, maybe the single market in goods, which we prefer to the single market in services or financial services, the EU will say, it's the whole package or nothing. And the EU doesn't want to do a kind of bit-by-bit negotiation with Britain, as it's done with Switzerland over several decades. It's a deal they really hate in Brussels. So I think it's going to be slow and painstaking, but you can see a trajectory back towards more European integration. And Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin probably played a key role in that.
I want to come to the rest of you, but I'll just bring in two comments that pick up on 2 points you've made, George. Catherine Stewart asks, have the EU's objectives changed too much in the past 10 years for Britain to rejoin? Keen for your thoughts on where the EU is going that diverges from the UK. And Tanya Morrison says, I expect I'm not alone in being a Remain voter, but also thinking that trying to reverse and rejoin is not the best way forward. What is the best pathway to better relations with the EU that is good for the UK and also attractive to member states? Katie?
I think it is this incrementalist approach that George was just talking about. That's the only way to kind of get this over the line. I think George is absolutely right. This is just such a Brits have such a kind of allergic reaction to thinking or talking about Brexit. It's only the fact that we've got this 10-year anniversary that's forcing us to face up to how the country has changed over the past 10 years that makes us want to go there. And yeah, I do think Europe would have quite hefty demands of us if we were to seek to rejoin, the single currency being the most obvious. And again, that would stir some quite strong opinions. And in addition, Europe can't take the risk that we just keep changing our minds about this every 10 years. This is just, it's not worth it to them. We were beneficial to the EU, writ large. We were good members of the EU, but we can't push it too far.
Delphine.
Adding to all of that, I mean, the conditions aren't right now because individual voters, but also businesses, have no appetite for a descent into all of the sort of fraught debates that were worked through over so many years. And equally on the EU side, there is absolutely no point in negotiating with such a manifestly unstable negotiating partner. That context can change. And it did, to some extent change over the last couple of years with the US sort of withdrawal from NATO commitments and a sort of general geopolitical sort of fears and sort of, new emphasis on defence. What will be interesting, sort of as and when Andy Burnham might arrive in number 10 and we move towards the next election, is, what is said in the next manifesto on sort of intentions for the future. And could we see ourselves on the other side of the next election with some kind of different sort of mandate from voters that would make us, make it clear what you were negotiating with?
Stephen, this is an interesting idea from Andrew Dundas, who asks, would it be sensible for Burnham to keep Starmer as our EU negotiator, considering Burnham's lack of EU experience?
I mean, no, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we shouldn't forget that although Andy Burnham has been a mayor of Greater Manchester, he was actually a cabinet minister under New Labour when every minister, because we were still happily in the EU then, was having monthly or in some cases fortnightly meetings with their counterparts, whether it was in Ecofin or whichever group you care to name. So it's not like it's going to be his first trip to Brussels, but also I think towards the end of Keir Starmer's premiership, saying he was doing well on foreign policy was the equivalent of saying someone has nice eyes. You just said it to have something positive to say. But the reality is that this position of, I'd like to be closer, but I don't actually want to change any of the red lines from where they were when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, meant that by the end, I think lots of European politicians were like, look, this is just a waste of our time. And then broadly speaking, thanks partly to the mood music change that happened under Sunak, actually the relationship is as close as it can be if you aren't willing to flex on further payments in, free movement of goods, people and services, or membership of the customs union. And seeing as it doesn't feel like the politics are going to align on any of those anytime soon, I don't think there's anything really to unlock by keeping Keir Starmer in some EU negotiation point. Where I do think we probably will see a change is if we think about how we joined, having initially said in the 50s we didn't want to be part of coal and steel. We had a failed attempt to join under a Conservative government in Harold Macmillan's. We had a failed attempt to rejoin under Harold Wilson, and it was only on the third attempt when Ted Heath tried to get us in, which was, of course, partly to go back to the earlier question about is the EU changing too much, was partly because of a change in politics in France. You had Pompidou, who was more open to British membership, but I think also it will only be when on the other side of the negotiating table, it doesn't feel like EU membership in the UK can change with an election. So it will only be when the British right learns to love the European project again, which could happen quicker than we think, because the European project itself could move in a more Farageist direction quite sharply beginning next year, for example.
And I think you're hinting there at the French presidential election and perhaps the RN winning there. George, interested in your views on this. Stephen mentioned some of the barriers to closer relations, but on some of those principles, like more payments into the EU, the government has signalled that it is willing to pay to play. And on some of the other areas, like customs union, there are key proponents in the Labour Party who could be very prominent in a Burnham administration, including Wes Streeting, who's being touted as a possible contender for Foreign Secretary, who are quite amenable to that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that on in a minute. I was just going back to the earlier question about whether the EU has evolved in a unfriendly, UK unfriendly sort of way. Yes, I mean, there's been a bit too much regulation. I think that's what will put people off. And Stephen was absolutely right to say that Britain leaving the EU was bad from that point of view. But in other areas, you can see our interests are starting to align, and that does give us greater scope, I think, for reintegration. So we haven't really talked about defence yet, but we'll probably come on to that. But the external threat posed by Russia is forcing Britain and the European Union to come together and discuss all kinds of cooperation and joint defence funds and all the rest of it. Global trade wars, the fact that there are 3 big trade blocs and we're caught in the middle of a global trade war, China, the United States, that is forcing Britain to talk to the European Union about joining in some of these protectionist procurement arrangements designed to protect the European industrial base from external competition. So that sort of brings you closer together and sort of edge you towards discussions about the customs union, as you say. The customs union, I think, is the easiest next big step, as opposed to an incremental step. And you could easily imagine that being part of a Labour manifesto. Of course, it would mean giving up our trade deals, which Keir Starmer's been very proud of with America and India and South Korea. Have I missed any? Switzerland as well, maybe? Gulf. But look at the numbers. I mean, Delphine will know the numbers off the top of her head, but the economic gain from these trade deals is a fraction of what we lost. And the customs union, honestly, when we were covering this debate back in 2016, I mean, it's a failure of everyone, and I think I put my hands up to this as well. We talked a lot about the single market, but we didn't talk very much about the customs union. People in Brussels didn't talk about it. It was something that was set up in the 1960s. It was in a dusty file in the Berlin Wall. Everyone had forgotten about it. But actually, when it came down to it, that was one of the biggest problems we faced, wasn't it? It was the form filling and the box ticking. And I think going back into the customs union would be a wise first step back towards that sort of closer integration.
Delphine, can I come to you on some of the figures? Because we actually had quite a few questions asking us to assess how big a deal are these other trade deals we've been able to sign from being outside the customs union?
So the Office for Budget Responsibility scores their impact as pretty much nothing, is the simple answer. And the counterfactual is also not necessarily that you have no trade deal with these countries, it's that you have the trade deal the EU has, which could be quite similar.
And there's a question here from Lord Benjamin Stoneham, a Lib Dem peer, who says, how does a trading nation like the UK achieve economic growth, assuming EU membership is realistically not on the agenda for the next 5 or 10 years? Again to you, Delphine.
I mean, I think it's a bit of a premise to think that any government can generate economic growth. Clearly, there are things you can do with the EU relationship of an incremental kind, which help. There are a lot of other things you can do within the domestic economy that don't produce instant results, that could produce long-term results, a lot of which the current government has been trying to set in train around planning, around energy infrastructure. There are various things Andy Burnham is enthusiastic about, which, depending on what form they take, could be helpful. Fiscal devolution is something a lot of people have wanted for a long time. It's hard to know exactly what it means, but could be positive. And then you have these big questions at the moment about exactly what is going to happen with the spread and deployment of AI, where really nobody knows exactly how it's going to play out. But regardless of the relationship with the EU, the UK has potentially quite a strong starting position in its skills base, in the fact that we're so concentrated in professional services, in the clusters we already have in London, and all of the investment we have in the sort of King's Cross Tech Hub. And, this could go well or badly.
I think one kind of big picture thing to bear in mind here is that there's a very heavy sense in Europe that we're incredibly reliant on the US, right? So, the dollar is the world's dominant currency, fine, we all understand that. But we're also incredibly reliant on Google, on Amazon Web Services, on, lots of it of the financial system are fundamentally American. On Visa, the story that we had back in May about the international war crimes lawyers who were sanctioned by the US and woke up the next day and their Booking.com bookings had disappeared and they couldn't use Expedia and their UPS packages were getting sent back. There's a real sense in Europe that we can't carry on like this and that we need to have homegrown alternatives to some of the things that we've grown up with as American products and never really thought about it because America's been our friend and ally for the past 80 years. Europe needs homegrown alternatives, and there's no reason why they can't be, born and raised in the UK as well as in the EU. And I think it strikes me as pretty self-evidently obvious that we should be working with our friends in Europe at building those sorts of alternatives.
Well, that mirrors a lot of the rhetoric we hear coming from the UK government about wanting to, support the next British unicorn to rise up. But it hasn't been as sort of lively a tech scene in recent years in London as ministers want it to be, has it?
I mean, the perennial problem with the UK tech scene is that we're really, really good at incubating really good ideas and early stage companies. And then as soon as they get to the point when they're talking about needing funding rounds that go into the billions, then they end up going to the States because that's where the biggest pots of money are. I don't have a magic bullet solution to put all of that right, but the problem is not that we don't have the talent or the ideas or the ability to kind of get these things off the ground. It's when you get beyond that, and that's a common problem across Europe as well, to be fair. But it does, again, strike me as pretty obvious that if we worked together on this, that it would be easier to find a solution.
And it is also under the radar, absolutely the fastest growing part of the UK economy at the moment, and is becoming more productive as well, which is a rarity in the UK economy and actually quite a positive sign. It does seem to be something where financial services, which used to be the absolute motor of the economy, has productivity growth really tailed off post-financial crisis, and that's been a big drag ever since. It does look as if the tech sector has things happening.
I'll take two questions together here. Gian Piero Bentivolio asks, do you reckon without Brexit our PMs would have lasted much longer in the past decade? And Michelle Sang asks, what is the counterfactual economics scenario for the UK if you remove Brexit but keep the Ukraine war, COVID and Trump's second-term factors in place? Stephen?
Well, on the first one, I think it is obvious, not least David Cameron would not have had to resign, and he did have to resign, right? We can complain about the slight insouciance he showed at the end, but his party would not have allowed him to negotiate the terms of exit. Theresa May, then, through no fault of her own, in my view, was then left on the hook for the impossible promises that Vote Leave had meant, which was always going to wreck her premiership. The Conservative Party, in its desperation, turned to Boris Johnson, a man who they had always believed was A, a winner, and B, incapable of being Prime Minister, and he proved them right on both counts. And then Keir Starmer essentially ran on a platform of, oh, don't worry, I'll keep the impossible promises Boris made because I'll turn up for work and there'll be no day drinking in the office. That turned out, of course, to be illusory because I think we still haven't, as a country, got past the fact that what was unleashed, George is exactly right about the toxicity, but as well as the toxicity, what was unleashed was this, trade-off, talking about trade-offs, that's a weakness, just promise the moon and let that be tomorrow's problem. Until we can get back to, as a country, talking about trade-offs again, we are going to continue to rattle through prime ministers the second it turns out, oh, wait, there is a trade-off and no amount of promises or eyelashes can get you past that.
George?
No, I agree with everything Stephen said there, although I think probably there's an underlying factor which goes beyond Brexit. I mean, certainly in the case of, the first three prime ministers you mentioned there, Cameron, May and Boris Johnson. But I think subsequent to that, it goes back further than Brexit, doesn't it? It goes back to the financial crash and the stagnation of living standards and rising incomes. And the fact we've had 20 years in this country where people have not been feeling better off, seeing their public services declining. And just that sense of accumulating anger, and Brexit compounded that, of course. I don't remember, how quickly was the economy growing before the Brexit vote? Going into the 2015 election, it was growing by about 3%, wasn't it? 3% a year, something like that.
There were things that had been... we'd had this huge jobs growth. Wages were finally starting to grow again. There were things that were looking up.
There's a bit of catch-up growth, wasn't there, I suppose?
Well, this is the thing, no one, it's the completely sort of neglected point. Occasionally when I make a comment about the financial crisis, quite reasonably people involved in the coalition government who are often fairly hardcore Remainers, will go, but look, actually, the 2014 to 15 economy, which is key to why David Cameron was re-elected, they would argue does show that our problems aren't so much about the long-run consequences of the financial crisis and then they had turned the corner. Of course, we'll never know. As the other question alludes to, we are a country whose energy prices are tied to gas, and we've had a gas shock. We're a country that is very exposed to financial services. That's one of our strengths. And we had a financial crisis in 2008. So maybe we would still have these quite deep problems even if we hadn't left the EU. But crucially, it would have meant we would have been focusing on those problems. And I think there are so many policy areas where you can just see the impact of the fact that from 2016, really until Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, no government had the bandwidth to focus on anything other than our institutional relationship with the EU.
And it's interesting as well, like, you know, you look over to Europe and I think it is important to think about what they get right as well as what they get wrong. You know, it's not a perfect organisation, the EU, but you look at the example of Spain, it's gone its own way with incredibly high levels of immigration and with a really aggressive solar energy project that has untethered it from this horrible problem that we have with that are linked to gas prices. You know, it is possible to kind of innovate yourself, you know, around these really massive challenges, whether you're inside the EU or not. And we have just not done a lot of those things. And I think you can definitely argue that some of that is down to the endless amount of energy that we've poured into the Brexit project.
I'm sure that's right. And I'd also add, maybe as a factor, but something that's become an issue in its own right, is a change in parliamentary culture. MPs have become much more rebellious and ill-disciplined. There's a lot of
one other suggestion that somebody made to me last week is that if you wanted to have a calmer gilts market, it's not necessarily that you need a different Prime Minister or a different fiscal policy, but electoral reform would be, you know, a big thing that would, you know, perhaps if we've become a more European country and degree of division we have in the electorate. And
why would that help though, Delphi? I mean, if we'd had PR at the last election, we'd had a whole load more Reform UK MPs, wouldn't we? Is that what the gilt markets want?
I think they're looking more at the sort of five-party split we have at the moment, and the sense that people do vote tactically in individual constituencies when it comes to it.
Yeah, maybe.
That's true. And of course, Andy Burnham himself is a long-standing proponent of proportional representation, although I'm probably among the sceptics who think he'll arrive in Westminster and immediately start to give away power. On that question of the gilt markets, there's been a lot of interesting questions in what Burnham will do. Katie, give us a sense of how the bond markets are looking at his programme. He's been forced to sort of row back on his suggestion that the UK shouldn't be as in hoc to the gilt markets and said that he will obey Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules.
You might have noticed I kind of sighed when you mentioned the words in hoc. The problem with Andy Burnham saying that we shouldn't be in hoc to the bond market is that that's exactly what the words in hoc actually mean. Like, you owe people money. We are literally in hoc to the bond markets, and it's absurd to suggest anything otherwise. You know, we've got 100% debt to GDP ratios, we've got a lot of debt to pay back. So whether you like it or not, we are in hoc to the bond markets. And it's important for politicians of any persuasion to have a constructive relationship with the market, right? And to, you know, this kind of combative thing where, again, you're kind of, you know, a bit like when you're looking at the EU to say, let's blame our problems on the EU. There's a lot of people who blame our problems on the bond market, and it's just absurd on its own face. So Burnham does have a somewhat kind of wobbly relationship with the market. You know, he had an opportunity a few weeks ago to talk to a bunch of hedge fund managers. Hedge funds are an incredibly important part of how the UK government bond market works. He pulled out of that meeting quite late on, citing scheduling issues, and scheduling issues come up. But it is important to get that relationship working more smoothly. Again, as Stephen was saying, we've forgotten how to talk about trade-offs, and governments in the UK have pretty much forgotten how to talk to the electorate about tax and about, if you want these things, you have to pay for them. The money has to come from somewhere. So the big other place where that money comes from, it is the bond market. And when that's functioning well, it's a money tap. You can turn it on and off, and you can, as long as you can borrow at reasonable rates. So, you know, Rachel Reeves has said numerous times that it's absurd that the UK spends 4 times more money on paying back its debts than it does on nurses. And that's because we do have structurally really quite high borrowing costs. And any new administration, any new government of, you know, whatever party they're from or whichever part of the Labour Party they're from, it's their job to try and pull those borrowing costs as low as possible. It benefits all of us. And the ways to do that are to keep public spending in check, not to borrow too much money, and not to let inflation run out of control. Those are the ingredients that bond markets want to see. They will be willing to lend to the UK government if it does sort of slip on some of those things, but it will cost us more. And if you think about every little increment of a percentage point in borrowing costs, if you think of that in numbers of nurses and numbers of hospitals and numbers of schools, suddenly you understand those trade-offs somewhat better. And to my mind, it would be helpful if politicians could at least engage with the facts of what the bond market is and how it works and what it's looking for, so that we can have not a magic money tree, but so that we can have a more affordable source of funding that's not taxation.
I think, first of all, we owe you a debt of gratitude to tell us what hock means. I must admit, I didn't know. Did you not?
No, I hadn't thought about it, but it makes sense.
We're literally in hock.
We're literally in hock. Well, I mean, Casey's made the main points there. But it's very interesting that Andy Burnham had to retreat extremely quickly, not just about the in hoc comments, but his idea that you could somehow park borrowing for defence spending somewhere off the books, as if it didn't count as
They
real,
won't notice.
It's not real borrowing because it's called something else.
And George, can I also ask you, you picked up on a story about Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, who's been out and about saying that he isn't going to run because he's had private reassurances from Burnham on his plans for borrowing. Yes,
he said that, I mean, Darren Jones used to be the Treasury Chief Secretary, so the man in charge of public spending and seen as a sort of fiscal hawk. And he was reassured, he said, by Andy Burnham that his plans wouldn't involve more than a little bit of extra borrowing, I think was how he phrased it. And he was talking about an idea which I think some people in the city have suggested as well. I think it's done in some European countries, that if you have very specific projects overseen, for example, by development corporations, and it's quite targeted, you might be able to get away with a bit more borrowing. I don't know, Casey, would the markets wear that?
I was talking to a gilt investor the other night who was saying, you know, you can try and package up additional borrowing any way you like, but we're not idiots. We can see that this is additional borrowing, and if you have more borrowing, then your borrowing costs are higher. One thing about the past few weeks, obviously, there's been this kind of political drama in the UK. We love a bit of political drama in the UK. And at the same time, UK borrowing costs, benchmark borrowing costs from government bonds have been drifting higher. And there has been this kind of narrative that this is all about Burnham, and this is all because gilt markets hate Andy Burnham. This just isn't the case at all. Global borrowing costs have been pushing higher because there's a war in Iran, and there has been significantly higher energy prices. And if there's one thing that bond markets hate, it is inflation. And so actually, Burnham could get lucky here because the markets at least think that the Iran crisis is over. OK, we haven't seen the MOU yet. We don't really know what's in the agreement between the US and Iran. But whatever, it's deemed to be all over bar the shouting. And so borrowing costs globally have started coming down, and UK borrowing costs have been coming down a little bit more quickly than they have in the US. So it's actually plausible that Burnham could take office and preside, if you like, over this huge descent in UK borrowing costs and take the credit for it.
Burnham, can I ask a quick question to you? Because some people, like Jim O'Neill, Lord Jim O'Neill, who's been advising Andy Burnham, has said that the bond markets would be a bit more relaxed if they could tell that the extra borrowing was going to projects which were designated possibly by an independent body to boost Britain's long-term growth prospects. Do the markets differentiate between different types of borrowing?
They say they do, but in reality it's supply and demand. And if you have additional supply of bonds hitting the market, then that does cost the borrowers more. I think markets would be receptive to borrowing that did look tailored towards growth. You know, if you're borrowing to fund defence, for example, you need defence. We can't have conversations like this unless you've got a functioning defence system. But it doesn't create additional growth on the back of it. So yes, that I think the markets would be more receptive on the margins to borrowing that was tailored at energy infrastructure and more innovative industries. But at the end of the day, extra borrowing is extra borrowing.
OK, well, here's a related question. Henry Mendoza asks, between businesses and the GMB and Unite, both indicating opposition to Ed Miliband as Chancellor, I thought Burnham would retreat on that, but the idea is still being floated. Could Burnham still appoint him? Also, Wes Streeting apparently wants it, but I've never heard of him being a serious economic thinker before recent weeks. Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the reasons why there's so much chatter about who the next Chancellor will be is that most people in Westminster, most people in the Labour Party in Westminster don't know Andy Burnham very well, and they don't know what version of him is it going to be the actual mayor, where you had a quite pro-business, quite, dare I say, Blairite approach to you've got to get growth first and you worry about redistribution later, or is it going to be the kind of soft left friendly, oh, actually the Manchester project is really about control of buses and the essentials of life? But none of us really know which version of Andy Burnham is going to emerge when he actually walks through the doors of Downing Street. And that's why there's this fierce internal lobbying about the next Chancellor. So I don't think it's a misread to see the fact that the Ed chatter hasn't stopped as, oh, that means Andy Burnham is still considering it. That means that the people who want Ed Miliband will continue to advocate for Ed Miliband up until the second that, the box opens and it has, either Shabana Mahmood or Darren Jones or Heidi Alexander, who I continue to think is underpriced because she's a long-term Burnham loyalist. It is, of course, also true that Wes Streeting had not notably had opinions about the economy until 2 weeks ago. Admittedly, until 2 weeks ago, he was bound by collective responsibility. But one of the problems for the Labour Party is they didn't have that deep level of intellectual renewal this time they were in opposition than they did the last time. And that means that they don't have that in-depth thought about what type of economy they'd like, which is an essential prerequisite to governing well.
George?
You can certainly say that Ed Miliband has that, doesn't he? Yeah. In fact, of all the candidates we've discussed, he's the one who's thought most deeply about it. He's got a long track record on the Treasury. And that may be why he doesn't get it in the end, because, you speak to people, don't you, Lucy, who say, if you make Ed Miliband Chancellor, you're handing over your premiership to Ed Miliband. And he's an unusual politician, and somehow he managed to arouse the ire not just of left-wing trade union leaders, but also people in the city, and a lot of Labour MPs. My guess is that Ed Miliband won't be the next Chancellor, and Stephen's run through some of the alternatives. And Shabana Mahmood is, like Wes Streeting, someone who we don't know very much about their economic views, but they seem to be capable communicators and quite strong politicians, which may be what you want. Alternatively, you could go for sort of more of a middle ground, less threatening person. Stephen mentioned there. Who did you mention? Yvette Cooper, Darren Jones. I mean, I would chuck into the mix there, if you wanted to go down that route, someone like Johnny Reynolds, the former business secretary, Manchester MP, respected by business, or some people in business in the City of London.
Pat McFadden?
Pat McFadden, of course. The problem is it's starting to look, if you don't have Ed Miliband as your Chancellor, it's starting to look a bit like a Blairite tribute act getting back together again, isn't it? With James Purnell, who was in there was a firm Blairite as the Chief of Staff. Let's talk about whether David Miliband might come back from New York to be Foreign Secretary. If you've got to have some people on the left there somewhere. So it's a really tough choice, and the biggest choice I think that he's going to have to make in the next couple of weeks.
One thing about Andy is he is actually quite self-aware. He often tells jokes against himself about the fact he wasn't a very good Chief Secretary to the Treasury because he didn't like saying no. And I suspect, therefore, that he will want to use, and I'm sure lots of managing directors and CFOs listening to this will be having horrible flashbacks, having to be the one who, after the CEO's gone, raises for everyone. Has to be the one who says, buy raises for everyone. We actually meant raises for some. I suspect he will want a Chancellor who will do a lot of his saying no for him, because he knows that's not one of his skill sets. Whoever it is, I think they will probably be someone who, as George alluded to, can project that toughness, so they can be the person who goes, I know the Prime Minister just made some nice promises, but actually that costs too much, so go away.
Just looking back at previous chancellors, you would not necessarily say that being a serious intellectual economic thinker was the main qualification for a successful chancellor. There have been plenty of very well-respected chancellors, maybe Alistair Darling you could mention, who had an extremely good record in office without coming from.
In fact, actually, intellectual chancellors tend to have quite a dreadful record. Kwasi Kwarteng, brilliant books. Yeah, seriously, read it. Yeah, dreadful chancellors. Stafford Cripps, massive intellectual. I think actually, when we're thinking about chancellors who are both intellectuals and good chancellors, that really is a group that begins and ends with Nigel Lawson.
Yeah.
And when you speak to people in the markets now about who they feel more or less comfortable with, I wouldn't say that strong economic intellectual views were their main criterion.
Delphine, another question I want to put to you is around immigration. There's interest there and a big question mark over what Andy Burnham will do under pressure from his soft left backers to peel back the harsher elements of the crackdown on legal migration that Shabana Mahmood, the current Home Secretary, has put forward. Christian Anton Smedshaug from Norway asks, do you consider immigration to give a net supply of work, or do the demands that arise from newcomers, i.e. migrant workers who bring their families, result in more demand than supply? He also floats this idea of a more refined guest work visa being a solution. What do you make of that?
So I think the economists' answer to that would be that in aggregate across the economy over time, immigration doesn't solve a labour shortage. It increases the supply and the demand. Having said that, it clearly can help smooth the demographic adjustment. It skews the population a little bit more towards people of working age, at least in the earlier years. So it can make, perhaps your swing towards a bigger pension bill a bit less painful. It also clearly helps particular industries who hire a lot of immigrants. Whether that should be the answer if they're simply not offering good jobs is a different question. But we did see a lot of disruption post-Brexit in particular areas, followed by the very sharp increase in immigration that has clearly led to more of a backlash since. The second part of that question
was around a guest work visa, or do you think that's sort of ripe for?
In theory, that can work in that you bring in immigrants you would like to have in your economy, who then don't stay, become old, retire, draw their pension. In practice, what we've seen over time in lots of countries is that realistically people stay, they settle, and if you care about integration and helping people feel a part of society and so on, you might rather accept that that's how things are going to be, and not have some sort of unrealistic guest worker tag, which we saw in Germany was sort of not how things panned over time, and then later all these reforms were brought in on citizenship to help people feel more part of society.
And Andy Burnham's wife or partner is Dutch?
Belgian, I believe. Belgian, I think. Oh. Go
we
on.
can figure that out.
We can wiki this later.
Do you think that will give him a slightly different perspective on this whole debate?
Look, he's a liberal, isn't he? As Donald Trump famously said from a town somewhere in England. No, I would say he takes a very liberal view on immigration. I think there are two strands to the immigration debate, aren't there? There's the illegal migration part of it, and the hotels, which have, it's a brilliant Robert Jenrick idea of taking a problem and plonking it right in the middle of every single town in the country, which I think he'll continue to take a hard line on, and Shabana Mahmood may continue at the Home Office to deliver on that. But on the legal migration side of it, I think there's going to be a moment quite soon where the Labour Party will be, the debate will be starting to tilt a bit now that net migration numbers are coming back down to, what was the last one, 170,000 or something? It's come massively off the Boris wave peak, and some projections that we could be heading towards net emigration. So at some point we will have to have a sensible debate about immigration and getting the right people into the country to do the right jobs, and I think Andy Burnham will be quite open to that.
There's questions about where the British right goes, including this one from Esha Ghosh, a school pupil in the UK, who says in places like Britain, Germany and France, the mainstream centre-right parties have increasingly adopted the rhetoric, immigration policies and cultural stances of the populist right to survive. Did the populist wave crest, or did it simply dissolve into the mainstream, permanently shifting the political spectrum to the right?
Well, it depends on the country, right? I mean, the thing I would say, looking at Britain, France, and Germany, whether you want to call it the crest strategy, I actually, to self-promote, I did a column in which I called it Becrestification, did not work for the French centre-right. They no longer exist, and now the populist right are the dominant challenger. Thus far, Kemi Badenoch's strategy seems to be great at making people who vote reform say, oh, I'm going to vote reform, but I also like Kemi Badenoch. But it is doing the square root of naffle for the Conservative Party's electoral prospects. And unless something changes, they're going to be replaced. In Germany, it hasn't put the AfD to bed. I think, but historically, like, how did Margaret Thatcher, for example, destroy the National Front? Well, she did use quite ugly words like swamped in her first term. But also, I think it is unarguable that race relations in the United Kingdom were in a better state in 1990 than they were in 1979. I think thus far it's not clear whether or not the centre-right across Europe and indeed across the world can repeat that trick. Ultimately, I think the lesson we're relearning is that if you're a liberal democracy and your centre-right gets into trouble, you as a country have big problems. The most important thing in the United Kingdom, in my view, is not can Labour succeed, but can the centre-right in this country avoid the fate of its peers? Thus far, the omens aren't good.
Richard Oscroft Wainwright asks, a lot has been made about Burnham being a northern outsider, even if he is a career politician. Are there any comparisons in history about similar outsiders gaining office? He raises the idea of Jimmy Carter, but would be interested to hear in British examples. And he asks, what effect might that have on Burnham's ability to push through policy objectives?
Gosh,
George.
That's an extremely good question. I mean, the premise of the question is right. He's a Westminster insider turned outsider, isn't he? I mean, he's someone who I first met as a ministerial special advisor in his 20s. And he's a creature of the Westminster system who's reinvented himself very successfully. He's doing a big speech on Monday where I think the whole northernness and regional identity will come out very strongly. It's basically a speech about devolution. We did a story this week about how he's planning to move part of his number 10 operation to Manchester in a real symbolic shift. But there have been politicians who in the past have traded on their outsideriness. I mean, Stephen, you're more of a historian than I am, but Harold Wilson, played up, didn't he?
He pretended.
His working class with the pipe and the Ganex Mac. I mean, who else? I mean, some of the most successful politicians in British politics are people who somehow give the impression they're outsiders when they're the ultimate insiders. I'm thinking here particularly of Boris Johnson, who didn't look like he was part of the Westminster establishment, when in fact he was, went to Eton and Oxford and was steeped in the establishment. So
Farage as well, Dulwich College.
Another good example. If you can pull that trick off.
Yeah, I think often when people say they like authenticity, what they're actually looking for in some ways is the performance of a stereotype. So what Boris Johnson did very cleverly, as George says, he was from Conservative central casting, but he kind of performed this role of, I'm an affable member of the landed gentry who's kind of, in some ways, am I even political? Farage, I think, does a terrific, as viewers can tell, I'm a massive clothes source, but does a terrific job of dressing as this kind of, look, I'm from the old city, I'm from the days when you didn't have to get a degree, I embody a sort of a lost world that many of my voters still hanker for. I think the interesting challenge for Andy, and we actually see this embodied in how he dresses, right? He is dressed casually and dressed as, I'm this authentic man from the north who is different. Now, I think the thing is people want their prime minister to look like they're the prime minister. They want them to dress up a bit. And of course, the win condition in British politics is not to win the north or London, it's to win the Midlands. And I don't think that people in the Midlands are going to particularly care for this language, which kind of seems to talk as if they don't really exist, or they're just either an adjunct of the north or the privileged south. That is, I think, going to be the big political challenge for him. But if he can find a way to retain that authenticity, as politicians who've succeeded always have done that good job of playing a role. Margaret Thatcher, we shouldn't forget, essentially went from being quite different in how she presented when she was in the early 70s to stealing, in some cases almost literally, stealing Barbara Castle's clothes in how she presented as this tough, very strong, very impressive politician, which of course she then was able to back up with policy collateral. Maybe Andy Burnham can do the same.
Well, lots of food for thought there. That's all we've got time for now. This will be available to you as a recording for the next 90 days, and we'll also put it out as a Political Fix special, available wherever you get your podcasts. Please look out for the next subscriber webinar in September after the summer break at ft.com/subscriber events. But for now, it remains to say thank you to you for tuning in and for your excellent questions, and thank you to our terrific panel, George Parker, Katie Martin, Delphine Strauss and Stephen Bush. Thank you.